an updated impaired waters list watch, which includes Birch Lake and a portion of the Dunka River. Birch Lake is in Superior National Forest just south of Ely. It's officially designated as a wild rice lake, but the water now exceeds the state's sulfate standard. The MPCA is holding a press conference right now at the state capitol to explain what this all means. We will wait right now as someone approaches the podium.
All right, we're going to get started here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ingrid Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters and Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. We're here because yesterday the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency listed its draft impaired waters list. And for the first time, this list includes Birch Lake as impaired for sulfate. Birch Lake is located in Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness. It is a designated wild rice lake, one of the most popular recreation lakes in the Superior National Forest outside of the wilderness, and it is ground zero for proposed sulfide or copper mining. We are grateful to the staff of the MPCA as well as to Commissioner Kessler for following the science and using its authority to list Birch Lake as impaired for sulfate, as well as a portion of the Dunka River. We are proud to have enabled the agency to do this by collecting and providing data using approved and documented procedures. Along these lines, I'd really like to recognize the Save the Boundary Waters Science and Policy Team, Director Matt Norton, as well as Monitoring Program Manager Lisa Pugh, who diligently built and executed a very high caliber water quality monitoring program. This program began in 2020 when our team realized that the MPCA had almost no sulfate data that was usable from the southern and western half of Birch Lake. As a result, we developed a plan, assembled the equipment, and learned, followed, and began documenting compliance with EPA and MPCA quality assurance and control methods, all required to conduct a large-scale, high-quality water monitoring program on Birch Lake. The results from this work are unequivocal. Every sample in the western end of Birch Lake shows sulfate concentrations above the 10 milligram per liter sulfate standard. Now, Birch Lake is on its way to the EPA's final impaired waters list, which would make it subject to remediation under the Clean Water Act. Further, it would mean that no new permits could be issued that would cause a net increase in the sulfate load to Birch Lake. It is widely known that sulfide or copper mining is a dangerous source of acid, heavy metals, and sulfate pollution. Birch Lake's status as impaired for sulfate has now been added to the growing list of reasons as to why the Boundary Waters and its watershed is an entirely inappropriate place for sulfide or copper mining. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Becky Rahm, who is the National Campaign Chair of the Save the Boundary Waters campaign. And following Becky, we'll have Senator Morrison speak. Thanks.
Thank you, Ingrid, and hello to everyone today. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness ecosystem, sometimes called the Quetico Superior ecosystem, is one of the most precious swaths of public land in North America. The Quetico Superior, especially the Boundary Waters in Minnesota and Quetico Park in Quetico in Ontario, is gravely threatened by proposals to develop sulfide or copper mines in the Rainy River headwaters along the southern edge of the Boundary Waters. Polluted water from mining in the Rainy River headwaters would flow north, directly into the Boundary Waters and onto Quetico and Voyageurs National Park. Fortunately, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland signed a public land order on January 26, 2023, that banned mining on more than 225,000 acres of federal lands in the Rainy River headwaters for 20 years. The order covers every square inch of federal lands and federal mineral ownership in the Rainy River headwaters in Minnesota. This is the most important conservation protective measures passed in the last 45 years. Achieving this public land order was a remarkable team effort. Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness, or NMW, which is the founder and lead organization in the campaign to save the Boundary Waters, is headquartered in Ely, which is where I came from today. When the idea for the campaign and a large national coalition originated in 2012, NMW had no staff, 200 members, and a budget of $7,000 a year. Since then, it has become a powerhouse with a staff of 16 and a budget and an email list of more than 400,000 people. Since 2012, NMW has organized a national coalition of more than 400 businesses, conservation groups, and hunting and fishing groups. Kids for the Boundary Waters is a fun program of the campaign. Several hundred young people, youth, have been trained in wilderness advocacy and have traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress and agency and department heads in the executive branch. One Minnesota says that Kids for the Boundary Waters is the most lobbying group he has ever encountered. Our staff is phenomenal, and our board is extremely proud of them. Ingrid Lyons, our executive director, Matt Norton, policy and science director, Libby London, our communications director, are here with us today. The campaign coalition and its work generated overwhelming public support for protecting the Quetico Superior from hard rock mining. That support was crucial to Secretary Holland's decision to issue a 20-year mining ban. Since 2016, 675,000 citizens have sent comment letters or have testified at public hearings about protecting the Boundary Waters. To these people, representing the views of 70% of Minnesotans, the only acceptable outcome is a ban on sulfite or copper mining in the headwaters of the wilderness, total and complete protection. When we began this movement in 2012, people told us that we were on a fool's errand, that mining was so ingrained in Minnesota that the goal of a mining ban was impossible. Those people were wrong. Margaret Mead was right when she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." We still have work to do. The 20-year mining ban is the maximum period allowed under current federal law. The campaign will not rest until federal legislation is passed that makes the mining ban permanent. In Minnesota, the campaign has followed three strategies. First, we challenged the DNR rules on siting copper-nickel mines. We believe the scientific evidence shows that the development of any copper mine in the headwaters of the wilderness would lead to the degradation of waters of the Boundary Waters. We will try this case before an administrative law judge next spring. You will hear our second state strategy, state legislation, to ban hard rock mining in the Rainy River headwaters from lead sponsor in the Minnesota legislature, Senator Kelly Morrison. And following Senator Morrison, Ingrid will be back to talk a little more about our third strategy, the significance of the draft listing by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency of Birch Lake as an impaired wild rice lake due to sulfate pollution. Thank you. Senator Morrison.
Good afternoon. I'm Kelly Morrison. I represent District 45 in the Minnesota Senate, which is in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. I was proud to carry the Boundary Waters Permanent Protection Act when I was in the Minnesota House, and I'm very proud to be the chief author again, this time in the Minnesota Senate. Like many Minnesotans, I have a personal connection to the Boundary Waters. My husband and I have taken our kids every year since they were little, and it's a cherished family tradition for all of us. And we're not alone. The Boundary Waters Wilderness Area is the most visited wilderness in the United States. It is recognized the world over for its pristine waters, unique ecosystems, and stunning beauty. Having sacred, protected spaces in our world is an increasingly rare and precious commodity, which is why so many people want to protect this watery wilderness from the threat of sulfide or copper mining. Polling shows, as Becky indicated, that almost 70% of Minnesotans want permanent protection for the BWCA. They understand that pursuing one of the most toxic kinds of mining on the doorstep of this natural wonder would harm it irreparably. Sulfide or copper mining indeed poses an existential threat to the Boundary Waters. It has the potential to create an environmental catastrophe, the likes of which we have never experienced in Minnesota. Sulfide or copper mining has literally never been done without some kind of pollution or accident, and it has never been done in Minnesota before. It's known as one of the most toxic industries and is particularly ill-suited to water-rich environments like Minnesota. The evidence suggests that it would pollute the water, land, air, and wildlife and change the BWCA forever. This bill simply extends the existing permanent state ban on mining in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness to also prohibit sulfide or copper mining on state-owned lands and the issuance of sulfide or copper mining permits, licenses, and leases within the Rainy River's headwaters. Allowing sulfide or copper mining in the headwaters of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness would forever change the unique ecosystem and landscape of the wilderness. It would pollute the water and air, cause noise and light pollution, result in the loss of habitat and wildlife, and damage the regional outdoor recreation economy and tax base. And as a physician, I'm of course particularly concerned about the threat to human health that sulfide or copper mining poses. We can all agree that there are some places that deserve to remain sacred, and the Boundary Waters is one of those. Now is the time to permanently protect Minnesota's crown jewel, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. This unique wilderness belongs to all of us. Let's be good stewards of this place and protect it before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. The Boundary Waters and its watershed need permanent protection, and multiple pathways are required to achieve such a thing. Legislation, grassroots advocacy, science, and much more. Again, we are extremely grateful to leaders like Senator Morrison for advocating for this special place, and to the MPCA and to Commissioner Kessler for using the MPCA's authority to list Birch Lake and part of the Dunka River as impaired for sulfate. We will now turn to encouraging the MPCA to focus the power of the EPA and the Clean Water Act onto the prioritization of cleaning up this area. We will now take questions, and I'll ask Becky to join me back up here. We also have our Science and Policy Director, Matt Norton, with us. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
You covered a lot of things.
Yeah.
And one of them is the newest information, which came out yesterday with Birch Lake being on the draft list of impaired waters. So can you tell us a little bit more about Birch Lake, what's there, wild rice, and why it's so important to, the location near the BWCA?
Yeah, definitely. So Birch Lake is immediately upstream of the Boundary Waters. It is ground zero, like I said, for sulfide or copper mining proposals. And it is a large lake, and our data, and there are maps available here as well, demonstrate that it is impaired for sulfate. This is a big deal in particular because the designated use for Birch Lake is determined to be a wild rice lake. It is not only a popular recreational lake, but it also is home to extensive wild rice beds. And the science shows that sulfate very negatively impacts wild rice, specifically within the roots. And so it's significant for a number of reasons. One, sulfate has been polluting Birch Lake for a long time. And so with our ability to collect this data, this really robust, high caliber data, we were finally able to sort of elevate this issue to the point where the MPCA was able to use its authority to list Birch Lake. Like I said, if the process goes sort of through all the way and Birch Lake remains on the list and is approved by the EPA next spring on the final list, the fact that no new permits that would cause a net increase of sulfate to Birch Lake is extremely significant for our work trying to copper mining in the area, because that is a very well-known result of this type of mining. Further, it brings up some other interesting questions about why is the lake so impaired for sulfate? Where is this coming from? What impact does it have on the boundary waters? What is the responsibility of the state to make sure it's clean and to protect the boundary waters? So we're really proud of our work to be able to really elevate this issue and bring it sort of to the forefront. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything about that.
May I follow up just on that train of thought? Is the designation of Birch Lake specifically important because it lies outside of the 20-year mining ban that is covered in the BWCA? Birch Lake is outside of the BWCA, is that correct?
The Birch Lake is outside of the boundary waters, but the 20-year mining ban, it affects federal lands and minerals also outside of the boundary waters. So that we're talking about the watershed and the headwaters immediately outside of the wilderness area. So it is that very same area that we're talking about when it comes to the withdrawal. Sorry, Becky, did you want to add something?
I think
Paula,
the decision by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland was informed by a very extensive environmental assessment of the impact of sulfate or copper mining in this exact place, in the headwaters of the boundary waters. And her determination was made because her agency, the Department of Interior, as well as the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, determined that copper nickel mining posed an unacceptable risk of harm to the boundary waters. So it's this science that the MPCA acted on yesterday demonstrates in reality the risk. Our data shows that the origin of the sulfate that is now in Birch Lake and downstream of Birch Lake comes from 2 mining operations. So it really reinforces the science that was used by Secretary Haaland. Her order doesn't affect waterways, it affects federal lands and minerals when there's a unified ownership.
How does the Birch Lake being on Minnesota's draft impaired list, what does that mean to you with the work that you've been doing and the efforts of the campaign to save the boundary waters?
There has been a claim that mining poses no risk to the boundary waters because the mining companies do it right. The agencies are very careful to make sure that there's no negative impact from mining. This disproves both of those points.
Question?
No, I just wanted to, if you want to elaborate on that.
No.
Can you talk a little bit more about, Eric, can you talk a little bit more about the campaign's effort to get this data to the MPCA? Like, would this would not have happened had you not stepped in to gather this data?
That's correct. So the data that the MPCA used to make this determination, over 90% of that data originated from our science program. So when I mentioned Matt Norton and Lisa Pugh, it is this small but extremely mighty team of 2 that has developed a robust, really well-documented, really high-quality program, because we knew that there were high standards to get this sort of data seriously considered by the agencies. And so once we understood what those sort of rules and guidelines were, we set out to collect enough data and high quality enough data so that it was unquestionable. With the desired result being that this is the data that could be used to get Birch Lake as listed for impaired for this very reason. So it is really, I can't actually overstate how much it is based on our water quality monitoring program and our team and our organization. There are a few other data points that the MPCA has on Birch Lake that also come from other organizations like the 1854 Treaty Authority, but like I said, over 90% of that data comes directly from our efforts.
And how long of a time period do you collect this data to submit?
About, I think, 3 years for this data. Our program has existed for 4 years. But the sulfate data has been collected for 3.
2020, 2021
Okay.
We also have 2023 data, but that's not included in the MPCA. It doesn't include.
Yeah, so we've done it for 4 years. Yeah.
And I think one point, what the EPA, because we've instituted a rigorous program following the protocols of the EPA and the PCA, including the appropriate lab process, et cetera, the EPA has told us that our water quality monitoring program is the best they've seen of any nonprofit in the United States. So that detail and rigor has paid off in generating high-quality data that the agency feels comfortable in relying on.
Okay. Is there any way to, now that sulfate has been found in the lake, is there ways to clean that, or is this, once it's in there, it's never leaving?
Do you want to speak to that?
Is there any way to mitigate?
So the question was, what can the MPCA do about it at this point?
Right, can a lake be cleaned? Can you
Well,
clean water, or since it's in there and you just?
it can be. There are ways to do it. The Clean Water Act, the listing is supposed to make the gears of the Clean Water Act start turning. The next step should be the establishment, the calculation of the total amount of sulfate that could be dumped into the lake through its tributaries by the permitted mining companies each day without the lake exceeding 10 milligrams per liter. That's called the total maximum daily load. So the MPCA has to prioritize calculating that. Right now it's on a back burner. It's on the second category where they may not get to it for who knows how long. After there's a TMDL, the agency then has apportions the total load, the total amount of sulfate dumped each day between the different permittees, in this case, one mining company with 2 mining properties, one an operating mine and one a closed mine. And once there's an apportionment of the total load, it's the MPCA's responsibility to include permit limits on how much sulfate can be dumped through the various permitted discharge points. So there are a number of steps there. It starts with calculating a TMDL, and the MPCA has put this at a priority level 2 with most of the things they haven't gotten to in the last couple of decades, unfortunately.
So I'm curious, as kind of a follow-up, I know the goal has been to protect the boundary waters from this. And seeing this in Birch Lake, it's also been a concern that if Birch Lake were polluted more, it could impact the boundary waters. Is there a concern that having this amount of sulfate found in Birch Lake could also impact the boundary waters?
Correct. And I just wanted to add on one thing to what Matt said. There is a state standard of 10 parts per million that Matt talked about, which cannot be exceeded in Birch Lake. But when you get to the boundary waters, there's a different standard. The boundary waters is in a category called prohibited outstanding resource value waters. It's a big phrase. It's a non-degradation area. And so if the sulfate level, let's say in the boundary waters, is 1.2 parts per million, a load of 10 parts per million would cause degradation. And we know that obviously the water flows from the upper part of the watershed into the lower part of the watershed. So what happens from Birch Lake to the boundary waters and then flows into the boundary waters of Fall Lake is important and critical in achieving that non-degradation standard within the wilderness.
And Matt, you can tell us where you wrote this.
Matt Norton, the Policy and Science Director for Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness and the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters. But you had a question that was a little bit different, and I didn't get to that. What was that?
Yeah, I think maybe Becky answered it, but I'm just wondering, with the amount that is found already of sulfates in Birch Lake, is there a concern that that gets to the area you've been trying to protect?
Yes.
And could that cause degradation of more pollution?
Sulfate is a particular type of pollutant. It's called a a conservative pollutant. So it doesn't really, you can dilute it to some extent. Our monitoring downstream of Birch Lake shows that we can still detect elevated levels downstream because of the pollution in Birch Lake, and that's despite the tremendous dilutionary power of the rest of this really clean watershed. Any additional load of sulfate to Birch Lake would be degradation downstream because it is a conservative pollutant.
So how would you categorize this? I mean, someone asked me, is it dangerous? What are the words that you would use to describe it that everyone can kind of relate to?
Well, sulfate is a problem both because of wild rice, and there's a wild rice standard for it, but it also plays a really important role in converting elemental mercury into methyl mercury. We all know that mercury can bioaccumulate in the food web, and that there's a lot of mercury in fish that people catch, unfortunately. One of the reasons that mercury is there, in fact, the key reason, is sulfate. And sulfate plays a role of making mercury, turning mercury into a form called methyl mercury. Methyl mercury bioaccumulates in the food web. And so you add more sulfate to the water, you are, there's going to be an increase in methyl mercury and mercury in fish, and therefore mercury in people who eat fish.
So how about for where we're at right now? Because people hear, I think you're impaired, and they go, okay, so impaired. There's something wrong with it. But what is that? Is there another way to describe it, or is that just the best way to describe it right now?
We're
in really understandable.
sure.
Yeah.
It's polluted. Birch Lake is polluted. It has too much of sulfate, which is a mining pollutant.
Thank you.
And yeah.
This is going to be a question you may or may not be able to answer. Does this designation of Birch Lake effectively send any kind of message to the mining companies that move on, or don't you believe it's got that much power?
Well, that's not. I guess I have two thoughts about that. One is, if you look at their annual statements, they bring in significant money, and it's not the goal to close down the mines. That is not the goal. The goal is to have the mines clean up their pollution and stop dumping it into, Minnesotans' lakes, including Birch Lake. But the second thing is, and you can see this in the data in Birch Lake, a copper-nickel mine, a sulfide ore copper-nickel mine, like the open pit Teck Mesaba mine, which it would like to build. It's part of New Range copper-nickel. Teck and its open pit would drain into Birch Lake. And that ore body is a lot more polluting than the taconite ore is. And so you would see probably an order of magnitude at least more sulfate pollution from a copper-nickel mine if it went in. Most likely a couple orders of magnitude more. It'd be very, very bad.
Will this designation by the MPCA make them move it to the front of the burner, that this is a priority ore instead of being on the back burner?
Well, it's right now in the Excel spreadsheet that the MPCA released yesterday. There's a column N in that spreadsheet, and it's headed TMDL priority level, something like that. And the different lines are either a first priority level or a second priority level. And Birch Lake, unfortunately, this impairment is a second priority level. And it looks like every sulfate impaired water is on the second priority level, which is a problem because if you want quick action from the MPCA, then you want to be in the first priority category. To understand the definition of the priority levels, there is an October 2023 MPCA document that we would be happy to send you. It has a definition on page 4 of what the two priority levels mean.
I would just like to add, when you're talking about the mining companies and the impact of this listing on the mining companies, aside from the taconite companies that are located, on the southern and western side of Birch Lake, I think it's also important to note that the companies that are looking to the same area for sulfide or copper mining development show no signs of backing down. They have been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars doing federal lobby work in our nation's capital. And so it's really important that we continue this fight and we continue it on the many fronts that you're also diligently keeping up with. I know it gets complicated, but that's just what's required when you're facing international mining conglomerates, the likes of Antofagasta, which is the parent company of Twin Metals Minnesota.
I have one more question. You guys, Senator Morrison, could you just talk about the bill? I'm guessing you intend to propose again this next legislative session, and just the importance of it and the complementary factor to the 20-year federal ban?
Sure. Yeah, the bill has already been introduced, so it's last session. But as Becky pointed out, it is complementary to the 20-year ban on federal lands. So it would prohibit this kind of mining in the watershed on state lands. And we've seen that Twin Metals is persisting in requesting to do samples underneath and next to Birch Lake. So they're not giving up, to Ingrid's point. So it's very important that we protect all of the land, both federal and state, in the watershed to protect the boundary waters.
I think some people don't realize that there's different agencies over different parts of that area.
Yeah, it is complicated. But remember, water flows, and just because there's a designated line, the water right here is going to flow right into the boundary waters. So if there's pollution in the watershed, it will flow into the boundary waters proper. So we need to protect it. Thank you.
Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness and the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters have been submitting comments for the past couple of years asking Birch Lake to be listed. And I'd like to ask Paula Maccabee from Water Legacy to come up and talk a little bit about some of the difficulties we've had and the history with mining pollution and the MPCA.
Thank you very much, Matt. And I do want to second what I think Becky Rom has already said. The data set that was produced by NMW and Save the Boundary Waters is really an exceptional data set, and it made it much harder for the MPCA to ignore that data set. I think you also need to know the context that Water Legacy, in alliance with tribes, have been trying to get the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to list sulfate impaired waters for over a decade. And finally, in 2021, after numerous submissions of data and a lot of advocacy and government-to-government work by the tribes, the EPA told MPCA that they needed to list wild rice impaired waters. And what is such a positive thing now is just this year, 2024, MPCA is proposing to list 12 more sulfate impaired waters. So there has been progress, but it has been a continual struggle, I believe, for the scientists within the agencies to prevail because there's so much political pressure by the mining companies. And I think the important point is one that Senator Morrison just made, is that water flows, it does not respect the lines of boundaries that we might want to put on in our minds. And so if there is sulfate pollution, there will be consequences for increased mercury contamination of fish, and that would be true in the Boundary Waters watershed, and that will be true in other waters in Minnesota. So if we care about the health of fetuses, infants, and children, the kind of work that was done with Birch Lake to get the data, and the next step, which is prioritizing reducing the pollution, that has to take place now. Anything else?
That's great.
Thank you all very much for coming. If you need anything else from us, please don't hesitate to follow up with our communications